Hi, my name's Shan. I'm a PhD student here at UWA, and I'll be giving you a talk today on the population and spatial ecology of the Numbat and the Upper Warren, which is a project I've been working on over the last few years, and is a case study of the research and management involved around an endangered species in Western Australia. So firstly, just to give a bit of background to this research project. So I think we're all quite aware that we're living in a time in history where we're seeing some really huge changes in our natural systems. Just to give a bit of a summary of some of the changes we've seen. So humans count for 0.01% of the world's biomass, but since pre-human times, we've now started to see a 15% decline in fish biomass, an 80% decline in marine mammal biomass, a 50% decline in plant biomass, and an 85% decline in terrestrial wild mammal biomass. So that's pretty huge given the small amount of biomass that humans account for. So if we look a little more closely just at the total mammal biomass, so this has actually seen a fourfold increase, but within that mammal biomass, 36% of that is accounted for by humans, 60% is accounted for by domestic mammal biomass, and only 4% of that is wild mammal biomass. So that's quite a drastic difference between the wild and the domestic mammal biomass, and shows how out of proportion things are. So we have a pretty similar story happening here in Australia. So 87% of Australian mammals are endemic, but 29 endemic land mammal species have actually gone extinct in the last 200 years in Australia. And 35% of modern global mammal extinctions happen here in Australia. One of the threatened species found in Australia is the numbat. So this is a species that is endemic to Australia. They're pretty unique in that they're diurnal and they only eat termites. That's quite unusual for marsupial species, particularly in Australia. They're also endangered under the Australian Government's Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, or the EPBC Act, and under the International IUCN Red List Act. And they also happen to be the Western Australian state icon, which is pretty cool. So numbats have seen a huge decline in the last 200 years. They used to be across the southern half of Australia, and they're now restricted to two natural populations in Dryandra woodland and the Upper Warren region, both in the southwest of Australia. The drivers of this decline thought to largely be the introduction of predators such as foxes and cats, a lot of habitat loss, and some changes to the fire regimes across the country. So my talk today will focus on the population of numbats that is in the Upper Warren area. So this is an area to the east of Manjimup. It's a real stronghold for quite a few threatened species such as woylies, tunnel wallabies, and the western ring-tailed opossums, and also the numbats. And it's home to what's considered to be the largest population of numbats. So this is it here, and it has three different types of management scenario in it. So it's got the Tone-Pera Nature Reserve, Kingston National Park up the top, and Palgarup State Forest. So there were two main knowledge gaps for this Upper Warren population that we hope to explore in my PhD. The first one was looking at the home range and habitat preferences for this population. These have been studied quite extensively in other populations, Dryandra, but we didn't know a lot for this population. And secondly, trying to establish some population demographics for this population, such as the size of the population and potentially the survivorship and recruitment. So firstly, we'll just have a little look at what we did know for this population. So this here is just an outline of the Upper Warren region. So we knew that there was a big population of numbats here. We knew that they had some minimum requirements such as a bit of canopy cover to protect from predators, hollow logs to also protect from predators, but also to find refuge in nesting, resting, and reproduction. We also knew that they had both introduced and natural predators, so a lot of predatory birds such as goshawks, snakes can be a risk to them, and also introduced cats and foxes. So with this information, we were able to narrow the project aims for this project down to four main aims. So the first two were mainly based around getting some baseline population parameters and really nailing down the methods for tracking these populations. So up to this point, we only really had monitoring methods that provided us with estimates of occupancy or relative measures of density and abundance. That meant you could track changes in populations between years, but you couldn't really nail down an actual population abundance or density estimate. And so then aim 3 was really based around the spatial ecology for the species. So trying to work out what the home range area Numbats in the Upper Warren needed, but also working out some more fine-scale habitat preferences, so working out which habitat was of most value to them and how they used it. And then with this information, we hope to feed these parameters into a population viability analysis so that we could then project future population trends based on the demographic information that was available to us for this population. So just a bit of quick background here on how to track a population. So one of the most well-used methods is something called mark recapture. So essentially for mark recapture, you have a population of, we'll say in this case, Numbats, and when you go out and sample an initial sampling session, you might mark a portion of the population. You then go away, allow the population to mix randomly again, and you come back, sample a second time, and you'll sample a second portion of the population. You can then go and sample a third time, and that will give you a portion of the population that had been sampled in both sampling sessions. You can then use the ratio between these sampling sessions to get a population abundance or density measure for this population. So in order for mark recapture methods to work, you have to have a way of individually identifying animals. So as I mentioned earlier, we didn't have a way currently of measuring density or abundance for Numbats. So previous methods allowed for monitoring of Numbat populations, but they did this through occupancy or through measures of relative abundance. And these were largely using sign surveys, which included diggings and scats down the bottom of the screen here. And we had also had some trials with camera traps. So we really needed to find a way to individually identify Numbats. So we had found that camera traps did get quite a high number of detections for Numbats. And so we thought maybe this is a method we could use into the future. So one quite well-known method for mark recapture is using individual identification of animals with their natural patterns, such as stripes or spots. So Numbats do have both stripes and spots, and so we thought, can they be individually identified from photographs taken using remote sensor camera traps? And can capture methods be applied to these images? So answering the first question first of whether Numbats can be individually identified, we were very kindly given a data set of photos from the Department of Biodiversity Conservation and Attractions, or DBCA, which was from a larger camera trapping project that included the Upper Warren region, and they happened to get a lot of Numbats on their cameras. So we found that yes, they could be individually identified. This is so they have some cool patterns on their side stripes, but also they have another set of stripes just at the base of the tail, which is often quite unique. So once we had found that we could individually identify Numbats from their camera trap images, we decided to put this detection history into spatially explicit capture-recapture, which is basically a capture-recapture method where the location of each detection is included in the modelling process. So the GPS location for each camera. This provides you an idea of how many activity centres. So if you imagine each coloured dot is a Numbat, so how many Numbats can be within that grid. And it gives you a density estimate for the region rather than an abundance estimate, which non-spatial modelling programs will give you. So then we applied this method by taking a subset of the camera trap images that were provided to us. These were off 5 transects that were placed around the Upper Warren region. There were 50 cameras per transect, and each camera was 100 metres apart, and every transect was considered independent, so you wouldn't get the same Numbat on a different transect. So we put this into a multi-session spatial explicit capture-recapture model, which is basically a capture-recapture model where the sessions were at slightly different times. So it pulls the data from all of these sessions and gives us a record of all the numbats caught in those different sessions. So from this, we got a density estimate for the Upper Warren population of 0.017 numbats, and we expanded this out to get a rough population estimate from the area. So to do this, we used the naive occupancy rate that had been determined by a student previous to me. So this was basically the area of the Upper Warren that was considered to be occupied by numbats. And so using these two parameters, we got a population estimate of about 1,900 numbats, which is a lot larger than previous estimates, which were about sort of 200 to 500 numbats. So this was a really great result. However, this result was based off quite opportunistic data, and so it didn't give us an idea of the best way to sample the region for numbats specifically to get really reliable population parameters. So our next aim was exactly that question. How do we best sample the region using camera trap methods with macro capture to get population parameters for numbats? So to start developing this method of using camera traps with macro capture modelling, we decided to do a second pilot study. We chose two areas within the Upper Warren, one called Warwick and one called Dwelbin, which were both areas that we knew were occupied by numbats. We deployed 196 cameras, which at these two sites, and these were a mix of Swift cameras and Reconyx cameras, which are just two camera models that are quite well used in wildlife research now. So we had two stationary grids or static grids, and these were deployed 330 meters apart. And so the entire grid was 2Ks by 2Ks. The camera spacing we developed using a program called Theka Design, which is a design program for spatially explicit capture-recapture modelling, and it incorporates both the density of the numbats and the way that they use the area, and it gives you an idea of the merits of using different sampling designs. So we played around with a few different grid designs, and this was it was suggested that we space cameras around 330 meters apart to get optimal detection rates for numbats. So over these static camera grids, we deployed a moving camera grid. So this allowed us to test the difference between having the cameras stay in a stationary position through the entire sampling process, or moving the cameras periodically to try and increase detections of numbats. So the red camera grid is the moving camera grid, and we moved cameras 4 times, just rotating around the static grid. And this is a photo of the final number of locations where we deployed cameras. So we ended up being quite successful with the second pilot study. We got a total of 1,079 numbat photos, as well as a lot of other photos of other species within the area, which was really great. So this came down to 152 independent detections of numbats, and from that we could put this into a second model, a spatially explicit capture-recapture model, which gave us a density estimate between these two regions of 0.021 numbats. That's really not that far off the previous estimate we got for the region-wide one in my first chapter, and this was really promising. We also found that Swift cameras had a much higher detection rate than Reconyx cameras, so this gave us some really good information to use going forward. So our next job was to figure out how to best utilise this information to figure out how to best sample for numbats in the Upper Warren region. So this needed an analysis of the best camera type, movement type, grid design, and also a bit of a cost benefit, because every camera trap design would have a different cost associated with it. So moving forward, we used all of our simulations were based around deploying about 100 cameras, which we considered a feasible number of cameras for a management team to deploy and maintain in their jobs if they were to use one of these sampling designs moving forward. So with the camera type, as I mentioned, our Swift cameras were found to detect a lot more numbats than Reconyx cameras. So we did all of our simulations based around using Swift cameras. And we put all of our new parameters, so our updated estimates of density and spatial parameters within, so how the Numbats moved within each grid, into the design modelling framework that I mentioned, Seca Design. And we modelled different moving types, so static versus moving cameras. We also modelled different grid designs. So we had 4 grid designs that we chose to model. So what our first one was 4 smaller clusters of 25 cameras in 5x5 grids. Our second one was 3 smaller clusters of 36 cameras in a 6x6 formation. Then we did 2 clusters of 49 cameras in a 7x7 formation, and 1 larger cluster of 10x10 cameras, so 100 cameras in total. So we put these different grid designs into the model to be simulated, and we also added a costing element where every grid was assigned an amount of time for deployment, so then we could do a cost-benefit analysis at the end of the simulations. And this other graph down the bottom here is just an idea of some of the results that you can get when you do the simulation. So this shows the expected number of captures you would get in each simulation compared to something called relative standard error, which is a measure of the accuracy of your density estimate that comes out of it. So the lower that RSE level is, or the level of variation in your estimate, the better the estimate is. And ideally you would have your RSE at 20 or below. So that RSE line, which is the black line on the graph, you can see that gets to its lower point when the 2 green lines meet, and that's the number of new captures and the number of recaptures, so Numbats that are being recaptured on the cameras. And so that indicates that the best distance between cameras, which is those measurements along the bottom, is about between 300 and 400 meters. So those distances were put into the modelling framework as well to help us understand which grid design would be best. And so from this we found that the 3 6x6 grids were the most effective way. So we would suggest using clusters of 6x6 cameras and deploying these through the bush depending on the aim of your study, so potentially to get a better region-wide estimate, more accurate estimate, or if you wanted to compare different regions within the Upper Warren, so potentially getting different density estimates for these different regions. So moving on now to our third aim, which is to look at the home range and habitat preferences for this population. So firstly, again, we'll just do a little bit of background here. So what is a home range? A home range is the area that is used by an individual animal in its normal activities, so food gathering, mating, and caring for young. So it's really where an animal spends most of its time. But in order to get a measurement of home range, you have to be able to track the animal. So how do we track Numbats? It might seem quite simple, but they're actually really hard to track. Because they only eat termites, you can't attract them using traditional cage trapping methods. And they're also morphologically quite difficult to collar because the head is really small in comparison to their body. So we had some challenges in finding them. They're quite hard to find, as a lot of you probably know, and then catching them. And then we also had to develop some pretty specialized collars to be able to track them through the bush. So when you're tracking an animal, you have 2 main options. The first one is VHF tracking, which is when you put a collar around an animal that has what they call a VHF tag on it, and this emits a beeping sound, so a consistent beeping sound that you can hear through a special receiver using an antenna. So you basically walk around the bush and then with your receiver and antenna, and when you get close enough to the animal, so for us it was within a couple of 100 meters, you can hear that beep. And as you get close to the animal, the beep gets louder, and this helps you locate the animal. So a second method, which is becoming a lot more popular, is GPS collaring. So this, you attach a GPS tag to an animal, and this means that the locations, you can set a schedule where locations are transmitted up to satellites, and it records the GPS location of the animal at the schedule that you have defined. This is obviously allows you to collect a lot more data, and often a lot more fine-scale data, and it doesn't require a person to be there tracking the animal to be able to get the GPS location. but it can be really challenging to develop a GPS collar that is small enough and light enough for an animal that's a numbat sized, because often they have really bulky batteries to be able to have the battery life to collect and store this information. So for our project, we used a compromise between the two. So we had smaller sessions where they had GPS collars, because our GPS collars had to be so light. They weighed about 11 grams and they could only last for up to 21 days. And in that time, they were collecting effects every hour during the day. And so then in between these times, we attached VHF collars to the animals, and this just allowed us to relocate the same individuals so that we could sample them both in March to April and October to November, which meant that we could get a bit of seasonal difference in our GPS data. And this also allowed us to collect some other information on their habitat use. So here we have some of the results of this GPS study. So to the right here, we have some of our numbats wearing their little GPS collars, wandering around collecting information for us. And on the map, we have a picture of the home range sizes of these guys. So as you can see, there's a lot of variation. Some of these home range estimates are really small. Some of them are really huge. Our biggest was 280 hectares, which is really, really big for such a small animal. So the blue home range estimates are the ones that we took for autumn, and the orange ones are the ones that we took for spring. It's a little bit hard to see, but the home ranges that are slightly faded are the males. So we actually didn't collect information for very many males. We only managed to collect it for 2. They seem to just be a lot harder to catch. We're not quite sure why. And so just a summary of these are the median sizes that we got for them. So I've separated it by female and all, because as I mentioned, we didn't have many males. So it was really, we had one who was 80 hectares and one who was 280 hectares. So that a level of variation means we weren't really sure of the male home range size. But for females, they were roughly around 30 hectares, and that stayed pretty consistent between seasons. So here we're just giving another way of looking at the data. So this is one of our girls that we caught called Meryl. And this first little bit is her moving around her home range within the autumn period. And then we also have her, that was in the spring period. And then we have her in the autumn period here where she narrowed her home range down quite a lot. And here we have the raw data at the top there, and then also just a view of the heat map of her movement. So in the yellow areas, those are the areas where she really concentrated. So as you can see that she was largely using the same area, but it did shift slightly between seasons. And then this is an example of a male and female that were collared together. So as you can see, they kind of dance around a little bit with each other. There may be some overlap, but our sampling, like the consistency of our GPS locations when they were taken, means that we didn't catch any of that overlap. So you can see that their home ranges on the side there, the core areas that they use in the centre of those home ranges. So there's a small amount of overlap, but not really a lot. So from this GPS data, we were also able to get an idea of their habitat preferences. So we did this using taking a collection of the areas that they used and looking at the habitat associations there in GIS modelling. So looking at things like how far they were from the road, how far they were from areas that had been logged, areas that had a lot of water, different soil types, different vegetation types, that sort of thing. And we compared that to just a random assortment of locations from within their home range to see if there were any patterns that we could pull out. And we did have some significant preferences, which you can see on these graphs here, but they were quite small preferences. So they liked to be marginally closer to roads. They were slightly more likely to use areas that had been logged more recently. They preferred to be in areas further from water, and they had some small preferences in terms of soil type and whether an area had been burned recently. But as we can see, these preferences weren't large preferences, but they were significant. So they did have very slight habitat preferences across the landscape. We also looked at their habitat preferences on a more microhabitat scale. So we took a smaller selection of the GPS locations where we knew they had been, and we set up quadrats and sampled for a range of habitat parameters that we thought would be relevant to them. For example, the number of logs, size of log, canopy cover, undergrowth cover, and that sort of thing. And from this, we found that they had two main preferences on a microhabitat scale. So they really needed the presence of a hollow log, and they also seem to like to have an area of open, hard substrate. So having a bit of somewhere where they can see the area around them potentially, and also an area where they can quickly run away should a predator come along, seems to be quite important to them on a microhabitat scale. So it was really great that we were able to get this much information from GPS scholars, and it just shows you how useful the new technology, like this kind of technology, can be, where you can get multiple parameters for an animal, so you can get both the home range estimate and the habitat preferences, and of quite a small amount of data. So now we'll just take a look at the final chapter that I had in my PhD, which is looking at what the future trends might be for this population using population viability analysis. So to do population viability analysis, or PVA modelling, we use a program called Vortex 10, which is a program where you can input all of the known demographic parameters for the population and the species that you're studying. And you can use these to model the chance of extinction and the population trajectory for that population over time. So we had two specific aims that we wanted to look at when we did the modelling for Numbats. Our first one was to see whether this population had any sensitivity to any particular demographic parameters, for example, mortality, the number of young they have, any sex ratios, so parameters like that. And then our second aim was to see, to compare some different changes to the management that they are exposed to. So for example, firewood collection, prescribed burning, that sort of thing, and to understand what kind of impact changes to these management practices could have on the viability of this population. So just looking at this first aim, we undertook something called sensitivity analysis. So this is where you can run the program to have all of your parameters stay at the levels that you set, but you can have one parameter that is changed. So here we did between 0 to 100, and then you can assess the at what point in that change of parameter your probability of extinction increases greatly. So here we can see that female mortality is the most sensitive parameter for this population, but juvenile mortality also has a bit of an impact there. So that shows us that this population is quite sensitive to an increase in female mortality. We found a similar kind of pattern when we looked at the population size. So female mortality and juvenile mortality and an adjustment in the sex ratio towards a more female biased population were the only parameters that showed an increase in population size. And they also showed quite a sharp decrease in population size once those ratios of female mortality and juvenile mortality started to get a bit higher. As we can see, male mortality has not a very big impact, and this is probably because they're considered to be a polygynous population. So you can have lower numbers of males breeding with females, and so this often puts the female mortality to be a more sensitive parameter. So now we'll just look at some of the management scenarios that I put them under. So this is an example of predator control. So if we were to adjust the timing of the bait deployment of 1080 baits that are deployed in this area to control invasive cats and foxes. And so this was just a comparison of whether we increased the baiting to protect adult numbats or whether we increased the baiting to protect juvenile numbats, for example, when they're dispersing. And in each situation, when we increased the mortality rate for either the adult or the juvenile, we did a comparative decrease in mortality for the other age bracket to try and show reflect a real life situation where if you were to protect one over the other, you would often get an impact on the other. And so here we have in blue, this is showing if we were to decrease the mortality rate of adult numbats, and the red is if we were to increase the mortality rate of adult numbats. And then this is just showing this for population size and also for stochastic growth rate, so whether the population is increasing or decreasing. And we found that having an increase in adult mortality has much more of an impact on the population trajectory than if we were to have an increase in juvenile mortality. So then we can get an idea that it might be better to concentrate our predator control efforts to decrease adult mortality. Another scenario we looked at is around firewood collection. So within the Upper Warren, approximately 40% of the area is state forest, and within state forest, the public are allowed to take firewood for personal use. And so we modelled what would happen if there was a reason that firewood collection increased, and this led to habitat loss alongside roads within the state forest. So we did this by reducing the carrying capacity of the state forest area in accordance to buffer areas of up to 100 metres next to roads. And we found that as this carrying, even though it was only a portion of the Upper Warren, as this carrying capacity decreased, there was still a bit of an impact on both population size and growth rate, just because there was less habitat available to the numbats. So these scenarios really show us how useful PVAs can be, in that you can model situations before they happen, so you can get an idea of how the population might track if they were put under different influences in their management. And you can also understand which parameters need to be potentially investigated more, because that population might be most sensitive to increases or decreases in those parameters. Cool, so just to summarise here, some conclusions that came out of this project. So we've now got the beginning of a method to track population density and abundance for numbat populations. And through this, we also managed to get the first density and abundance estimate for the Upper Warren population, which was a really cool result. We also have a better understanding of how numbats use the habitat within the Upper Warren region. And through our PVA work, we have a better understanding of which population or demographic parameters this population is most sensitive to changes in, but also their potential response to if management scenarios were to be changed in the Upper Warren. So thank you for listening to this talk, and I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge all of the people that have helped me to be able to do this project. Thank you.